Hey, Lyssa.
Hi, Christy.
That is exciting to be with you because I just read your book. Like, I can't say I read it. I dived into it and read each part different times and took quotes and sent them to people and read it again. And it was so great. And so it's really fun to get to chat with you now about
Yeah.
metaphors.
Well, one, thank you so much for reading my book and also for sending elements of it to the world. I very much appreciate that. I I really, I feel like that is it's my third book and I do feel like it's the best one I've written so far.
It's really good. I mean, I tell people in my community, like, this is just your primer now for coaching, because it's concise. It covers all the competencies. It's through this lens, metaphorically speaking, of metaphor, but it goes way beyond that. Like, it really delves into each one of the competencies in a way that's crystal clear. Like, you could just use it as your textbook for coaching, coach training, right there.
Well, and that's interesting. I do have the Coaching with the Power of Metaphor program that I created. And the book really was a culmination of things. I had started running that program, I want to say, let's see, I don't want to mess up too much on my dates, but it was like in 2021. I think I had my first cohort because I'd really kind of gelled around this idea of how to really start looking at people's language in a really different sort of way. I think there's some similarities with clean language, but I don't think that I'm in a regimented sort of structured manner of listening, but really I pulled together this program and I start bringing the research papers in because I'm like, "It's research and I'm a nerd for neuroscience and people were like, please don't make us read research.
I
Um,
know.
I
I've
know
been
they were
geeking
like,
out on it. I love language patterns
oh
and
my gosh. Well, and I
yeah.
think the problem with a lot of research is they give all of the data as to how they did their research as well. And so I think people were kind of like, oh my
You read
God.
it and you write your own book so that
And that's what they
we don't
said.
have
They're
to.
like, make
Yeah.
this research digestible. And I'm like, I love it. I'm going to do it. So it really took what I'd been doing. And so then over the next three cohorts, I'm working with the students in the program and we're looking at what I'm writing and they're clarifying things. And they're like, that doesn't make any sense. And so it wasn't exactly a group effort in the sense it wasn't like me and a group of specific people, but it was me. I had a lot of people giving me ideas and thoughts and feedback. So it was very collaborative in the sense that it was becoming more clear as a result of talking to people about how to communicate about it. And if I'm hearing you correctly, that was a winning strategy because it's fairly easy to read as a result of that also.
Well, and very concrete, metaphorically speaking, that you use really specific examples of
Mhm.
like, this is exactly what it would sound like from a coach responding to a client. Um, and it's just so helpful when people know that you don't just let a metaphor slip on by, but that you have all these ways that you can kind of
Even just
dive right
inserting the
in.
language into your question so that the client knows that you've been heard. And it's sort of interesting. I mean, you experience this, I'm sure, because I'm going to guess, and you correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm going to guess you've listened to a lot of coaching for assessments. And so one of the things that I think gets misunderstood when we're looking at something like listening actively and, coach summarizes what the client offered and you get a coach who is like in some sort of speaker listener technique for marriage counseling where they're like, I heard you, Christy, you said A, and I heard you say B, and I heard you say C, and I heard you say D. Did I get that right? And get that right is not actually a question from a coaching perspective. And so the summarization is like what you would do if you were in a landmine kind of conversation with an angry spouse. And you have to be really careful and make sure you enunciate and clarify so that they won't get mad and you've demonstrated that you actually did hear them. as a coach, though, I mean, our clients are coming to us and they're just riffing off their ideas in their brain and they're throwing out this language around how they're conceptualizing their situation. And so we don't have to summarize like we're in some sort of like passing the baton for safety. We can say, God, I really heard, that you're kind of like, you could easily go down the rabbit hole right there. And if you weren't, and what's keeping you from the rabbit hole or what's in the rabbit hole that might be worth investigating. And the client will tell you, but they know that you've heard them because what you've done is you've picked up on the key elements of their own language. So
And
they,
often the metaphor is the key element. The fact that
yes,
they offered you that really juicy rabbit hole that you can pick up on. It's
yeah,
often there's just such rich visualization and feeling and sounds and all kinds of stuff in
yeah,
the rabbit hole that you can kind of tunnel down with them and see like what's in here for you and what's wanting to emerge from the rabbit hole and
yeah.
have a
And
lot of
and I
fun.
think that that's the piece, right? Is like what I hear consistently from people, and I don't mean clients. I hear this from my clients. I hear this from the people that I do coaching demonstrations with. But I hear this from my students in that Power Metaphor program is that their clients tell them, I don't know if I've ever felt so heard. And if you think about it, I mean, I know we're kind of getting a little bit far afield from the metaphor specifically, but this need to feel heard, I think, is fundamental to what coaching really has to offer people. In a world in which most of the people who truly listen to you probably also have a bit of a attachment to a particular direction you might go. Like my husband will listen to me and he may listen to me really, really well. But if I say, I want to throw all this away and I've decided I want to go live in a commune in Bali, he's probably going to have an opinion about it that may be very like, and let's talk more about this and let's get the baton and let's start passing it. But I mean, but there's very few people that listen to us deeply for our benefit and exploration without an attachment to the outcome. So, I mean, I think ultimately when I think about coaching, I think of this need to be heard. And I mean, we all have people in our lives who listen to us if we're lucky. Honestly, let me just reframe that. If we're really lucky, we have people in our lives who listen to us, but very few people do we have in our life who are unattached to our choices and our outcomes. And so, I mean, I think it's really fundamental that as coaches, we understand when a client comes to us, not only one, we're not having a challenging conversation with a loved one where we need to be really careful, like we're walking through a minefield, but rather we need to be able to demonstrate that we're truly hearing them. And I think one of the things that has been really interesting, I hear it from the people that I work with, I hear it when I do a one-off coaching demonstration, and I hear it from my students in the Power Metaphor program that their clients say to them, I don't know that I've ever been fully heard like this. And it's not because of this giant, I heard you say A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I, J, K, but rather because we're pulling on these elements of interesting language that people are using. We had mentioned the rabbit hole a few minutes ago. I have an example. I was watching a coaching demonstration in a course I was teaching, and the client said, I really want to talk about my social media marketing. And I just feel so lost in the weeds. And the coach said, well, working on the agreement setting, what would be different? And the person kept saying, well, I'd be able to see above the weeds. And the coach got kind of lost because they didn't know what to do with the weeds. And so the conversation just sort of went in a circle because the coach didn't know how to really reflect back. And if you had your head above the weeds, what would you be wanting to pay attention to? Like, how would you start to notice what allows you to be above the weeds? And I said at the end, I go, may I do a quick little reframe on this coaching? And so we started again with, I really heard you're in the weeds. And he said, yeah, I'm really in the weeds and I just can't see above it. And I'm like, and what would you want to do from these weeds? And he goes, I really want to pop my head up over the weeds. And I go, I go, "May I just share? I just see like you're a meerkat, like up above the weeds and kind of looking around." He goes, "I'm a meerkat." Um, and so at that point, what do meerkats do, right? Like, and so we were playing with this idea of I'm a meerkat, and it was hilarious because all of a sudden it went from being this heavy, frustrating, I'm in the weeds and I can't see, to I popped above the weeds. Like, I'm just going to stand on my back feet and I'm going to look around and I'm going to pay attention to everything around me in a much more playful and fun way. And I think that's the other thing that the use of the metaphor does, which is it reduces cognitive load. And I don't know if you said this, and everybody will have heard it, or you and I said it when we weren't recording. But there's this truth that is that the metaphor that the client is using may be novel to you, and therefore you're not sure what it means, but it is not novel to the person using it. And while people use metaphors unconsciously, like he's not thinking, I'm going to speak in metaphorical language, he's just talking about being lost in the weeds. Um, his brain knows exactly what that means. And so it is not used accidentally. And I think that is
Yeah.
really crucial to understand. And there was some really interesting research, and I know you like research, so I'll share this one with you. It's by Vicky Lay out of the University of Arizona, and she was doing research around novel and conventional metaphors. And the research wasn't for coaching; it was really just how the brain responds. And when there's a conventional metaphor, one that you know, it is easy. The brain it's just easy. When it's a novel metaphor and it's not one you know, it creates a cognitive load and it takes longer to process what that metaphor means, which makes perfect sense, right? This is kind of new. So going back to what we were talking about a moment ago, where the client knows what the metaphor they're sharing, even though they don't know they're sharing a metaphor, they know what it means. They know what it
And
means.
it's so rich for them. Like they've got all these
Absolutely.
these feelings and images and sounds, and it's like this whole like they've got, is it what kind of weeds? Are there a bunch of flowers in the weeds or not? And how tall are the weeds? And they know all that. And so what they don't realize is that when you respond with their words, it feels to them like you're seeing and feeling like you're right there in the weeds with them just because you said the words in the weeds. Even
Mhm.
if your internal representation of the weeds might look and feel different from theirs and you don't even understand what they're talking about, they still feel really understood because
Yeah,
you
they feel
used their
heard.
metaphor and it's this whole world that they think you've understood,
Yeah,
which is all you need to do. Like you don't actually have to understand.
you don't have to actually understand. And it also speaks to, this is sort of a different direction that I'm heading in my work a lot, is there are visual metaphors like, I'm stuck in the weeds. That's a pretty visual metaphor, I think. But there are much more subtle somatic metaphors that people use. And there's some really interesting, quite a lot actually, of very interesting research about how words that are textural will activate structures in the brain around texture, and words that are like around taste will activate, like, so it's like life feels sour is going to have a sort of a reflective response, not only for the person saying it,
I
but
just
if I
started salivating. I
yeah,
tasted a
as soon
lemon
as you
right
think of
there.
like biting into a lemon, like, okay, we all know that experience, right? We have a biological response to it. So I think there's really power also in the fact that, to something that you just said a minute ago, that client who says they're in the weeds, they see the weeds around them. The weeds feel high. They feel small. They're having a whole bodily experience with the words that they're sharing. And for the coach, again, you don't have to know. Please don't ask them to explain what it means to be in the weeds. Like, that is not necessary. The
Do
client
not
already
kick them
knows.
out of their metaphor into the concrete. Like
Yeah,
stay with the
they,
grasses that are
yeah,
growing, not the how does that relate to your team or you know,
exactly. Don't pull them out of their flow. Because as soon as they get out of their flow and they have to explain it to you, now they're in cognitive load, number one. And then they're also, to your point, cognitive load. And now they're stuck in their head. And this is the problem with coaches bringing metaphors. It's not that coaches can never bring metaphors. So if you and I are talking and you say, I'm really trying to navigate this situation, and I say something to the effect of, as you're navigating, what sort of compass do you use in that process? Or do you have like how do you map that? You may say, well, it's not really a compass, but it's not so far out of alignment to what you've said that it's going to feel like I still heard you, even if I didn't hear you correctly, which gives the client an opportunity to go, yeah, it's more of a map and less of a compass or whatever, which is totally fine. But here's where the problem comes in. Most coaches, I feel, do not do enough reflective practice on their work. And as a result of that, they do not highlight what clients have shared with them, which is one of the reasons why I am a huge advocate of transcript analysis, because you start to highlight all the words that are metaphorical and powerful for that client that they have shared in that 1 to 2 minute story that your eyes are glazing over on. And you start to point out those powerful words or metaphors. And people will say, I'm just so challenged by, I'm challenged by, I'm challenged by, I'm challenged by, in multiple different ways. And so a coach who doesn't come back with, I'm really hearing the challenge that's showing up, what would you like to do with it, has missed the opportunity. And if instead what they do is they're like, yeah, it's like you're really like grappling with heavy lifting rocks or something. And the client again, now the coach has brought in the metaphor that is this challenge for them, but that it doesn't resonate with the client's brain. And so maybe you hit it out of the park and they're like, yes, that's exactly it. I'm lifting heavy rocks. On the other hand, a lot of the time the client has to stop and go, is that what I mean? And now
It didn't feel
again,
like rocks to me.
yeah, it
Yeah.
doesn't feel like rocks to me. And so
Felt more
then
like wrestling
again,
or whatever. Yeah.
they're back in their head. And now they're trying to make
Yeah.
sense of the sense that you made of what they said to see, and then they have to explain it to you. And that's the problem, right? So now we're out of flow with what was important to the client to explore. And if
Well, and
you're,
I'd love to talk if I can interrupt for a
oh,
second. You
please.
started using the word somatic, and then it was really funny what we both did with our hands, because we're talking about people going back into their heads and so their body, and you know, I did this and you did this, and we were both kind of pointing at our foreheads and stuff. And um, for me, the ICF is really overly focused on words and word-based coaching, and not enough aware of the somatics. And so I'd love to hear you talk a little bit more about, like, you don't always have to say the word cognitive load or into their head, but you can just, like, in the same way that words are symbols and you can repeat them, like, the client says mountain, you're going to say mountain, not hill, because that was their imagery.
Hmm.
You can do that with hands and body and breath and any kind of movement that you see. And so if your client does this, you can just do that same hand, same side of the head, same, you're not doing it up here or somewhere else. You Just that fact that you did that, they
Hmm.
also feel really heard.
Yeah.
um
And I think that really is important, because I think that there's we know about mirror neurons, right? And so we understand that we feel heard when we are mirrored. And so as a client is talking and you're like, where are you noticing that right now? And they're like, I'm noticing it right here. Being able to do that, what you just did, that mirroring demonstrates listening. Now, that's
And
not
it
going to
wasn't
show.
over here and it wasn't here. It was like, the more exact you can get their somatic movements, the more they feel like, yes, like, it was that kind of fist. It wasn't
Yeah.
that kind of fist. Like,
And then you can ask, what would you like to do with this? Or what is this telling you? And that
mhm.
allows them to have that experience of, what is this telling me? Because we do things like this for a reason. It's like it's a physical metaphor, right? And so what happens is that I've done it for a purpose. I'm tight right here, or I can't breathe, or, I'm like, or whatever it is, or I'm just talking like this, and I'm doing it for a purpose. And so for a coach to be curious about what is happening here. I had a client who I asked them a question and they came back and they went like, they made a face. It was funny as anything. So I asked the question and they go,
Love it.
and I'm like, I sat with it for a second and part of me in my head, I was like, I wonder what I just did. And then I asked, okay, that's a face. What just happened? And the client responded with, that's the face I make when my mind gets blown. I wouldn't have made that assumption, but by noticing that sort of nonverbal and asking about it instead of making an assumption, because I kind of thought maybe I stepped in something, like I wasn't sure exactly what happened there until I asked. And then the clients are so gracious and generous with us when we just ask them, like, what's happening there? And they'll tell us. It's amazing. And so, but I do think that that sense of being heard happens on multiple levels. It isn't just words. It is also
Yeah.
in how we mirror the person that we're speaking with.
And you kept it really clean and curious. You said that's a face. You didn't say that's a surprised face or that's
I'm
a
laughing
sucky
as I
face
said
or
it
that's a
too.
anything. It's just that's a face. It's very neutral observation for them to rebound back with what it was
Yeah.
like to be
Well, and
them in that moment.
I will be honest, it wasn't like exactly neutral, like that's a face. I was much more like, wow, that's a face. Because it was kind of funny, and it was a and I wasn't afraid of the face. And I think that the bit of humor that I brought into my question, I mean, it could have been, yeah, I'm really upset about how you said that. Then I would have shifted gears, but I didn't have the sense that I needed to go to a negative place first. I could be like, what just happened? That's interesting, right? And then we can talk about it. And I think to your point, it is just so crucial that coaches are not just listening on a word level. I think words are valuable and important. I think where the ICF really has people focused though is, and I had a really interesting conversation with Dr. Richard Boyatzis, and it just a few weeks ago, and one of the things that he was talking about was this idea of motivation, and we can't use like a grow model of to motivate people. Yeah, we can create a goal with a grow model, but we can't really motivate people with a grow model. And I think that that's where really coming up with purpose is important. And the reason I bring this into the conversation with metaphors is I want to be a good leader. I want to be a great leader. These are grow model kind of goals, right? This is like, okay, now we can figure out what you need to do, and here's all your action steps, and these will be the indicators that you've done it, and voila, you're a great leader. But that isn't the kind of goal that people really get excited about. And so, I mean, I talk about in my book a lot around the embodied grounded goal. And this idea of we've got to get to what the purpose is for the person. Why are we doing the coaching? Number one. But what is the purpose? Like, what makes you a great leader? Let's break that down. Let's find that juicy goal that they're like, yes, that's what I'm doing. And I remember I was working with a tire executive from a tire company. And one of the things that had come up in his leadership style was that his team did not feel appreciated. They didn't feel listened to. And so he was having some team related issues as a result of not, having good rapport with his team. And as part of this process, we did an assessment. But as we're looking at the assessment, one of the things that became really clear was he had a passion and drive to make sure his customers' needs were taken care of. That was crucial to him. And I'm like, and as you think about these customers that have a hard drive to support and take care of, how does your team fit in with this? And how is this dysfunction, I don't know that I use that word, but how is this, kerfuffle that's going on with your team impacting that? And he stopped and he goes, I need to treat my team the way I treat my customers. And I was like, talk more about that. And he goes, that's the key. I treat my team the way I treat my customers. That became his embodied goal because it's a behavior that he's going to have to shift. Not to something he doesn't know how to do, to something he knows, but because it came from him, that became our overarching goal for his leadership. Everything that needed to happen, his open door policy, his taking ownership of mistakes, his communicating more clearly, his asking about people's kids and lives and getting to know them and having a coffee break with them. All of that came under the auspice of what he would do for a customer.
Yeah, and I loved your metaphor, even the title of your book. I can see your book is hiding behind you.
Yeah.
If you want to
Poster
if you want
version.
to show it to us,
Yeah.
like what can you say about that embodied goal? What lights up in the brain um
Well, we
when you have that?
know, right? Like, I mean, I think there's enough research out there at this point based on studies of Buddhist monks and all the different college students who have been studied copiously about the fact that we are more than a head brain, right? Like we're a whole system. And when you think about it, I mean, even an amoeba has a stomach. So we know that the stomach is probably the earliest brain in the body. And I would say, though the research isn't really strong yet, that probably we have more than a head, heart, gut brain. We have multitudes of physical brains. But these things, that they're these neurons that are part of this entire system. When we say words and it triggers areas and structures in our brain, it doesn't just stay there. It moves. So when I say, it's like when it's sort of interesting along the lines of there was a study done where if I'm holding this cold glass of water, I'm more likely to have, I'm more likely to not feel warm, right? Whereas if I am holding this nice warm cup of coffee, I'm going to be in a different emotional state as a result of the warmth of the thing that I'm holding. So if this is true, and I believe the studies show that this is true, that means that what I'm holding in the moment that I'm having a conversation with somebody, and now if it's really hot, like in your room, holding this cold cup of coffee maybe, or cold water might be the exact right thing to bring energetically into the
Oh,
situation.
you're so refreshing. I love being with you. I'm gonna take a
Exactly.
sip.
Exactly. So it's not that one is good or bad. It's that things external, that we are a whole sensory being and things impact us and they become alive in our brain as a result of it. Right. And these structures that, like, if somebody's talking about having a rough day, both your and my brains have lit up to texture. Can't
Yeah,
help it. So cold,
love it.
hot, heavy, light. These things are more than words. They're just more than words.
Yeah, and they're lighting up different parts of the brain, like you said, and different parts of the system, um, to make the coaching that much more full-bodied and real and active and effective and long-term and all those good things.
Well, and that's the thing too, Christy. I am so glad you said that. Embodied grounded goals and coaching conversations where people are encouraged for that inner work that they're doing. I don't mean like spiritual work. I mean that internal work that they're doing to understand their challenge and to move towards the thing that they say they want. That becomes sticky when it comes out of them. And this is
Right.
really the difference between consultation and coaching in my mind. I think it also is, I'm not saying there's no place for consultation or teaching or counseling. I think all of those roles have a space that people need. If I'm building a chicken coop, please do not ask me about my feelings about chickens. Like that's not the purpose of the conversation. Really give me a recipe for how to build the chicken coop that I want that looks pretty like that. But I think that I'm not going to retain the chicken coop information for the rest of my life because once I've done the chicken coop, I'm going to control alt delete it and move on with something else. When I come up with one of these internal awarenesses that is drawn from my language and the way that I'm exploring something with your support as a thought partner, I'm going to remember it in a way that I will not remember if you just told that to me.
Absolutely. And I feel like in the goal setting is so important. You're talking about like you're activating this imagination. And one of the things that we teach at Awaken is, there's the SMART goals, which are limited, successful, but we've rewritten them. And the A of SMART, we say it's as if. And so we're inviting our clients to move into this like 360-degree movie of their life. And so, like, when you've got what you want from this conversation, how are you breathing? How are you walking? What do you hear? What do you see? Like, if you turn all the way around, like you're in the movie, you're not watching the movie, you're stepping into the movie. And then you look around and you're like, oh, there's my friend, Mwangi showing up in the picture. And oh, look at that. And I feel so confident. And so you're creating this whole realm of sight, sounds, feelings, resources, values, everything that's in the picture. And you were talking about motivation earlier, and it's so much more motivational to move toward something that you've
Yeah.
already experienced in an embodied way than to just be like, my measures of success on a 2 to an 8, I want to move to an 8, or,
What's an 8? I mean, I guess it's a
right.
metaphor for something, but it's a
Yeah.
kind of a shallow one. And to your point, like, I mean, and this is really where agreement setting comes in, where you're really looking at what is a success measure. And I think if we're looking at a sliding scale, honestly, that's a pretty cliche success measure. I think if we're looking at a success measure that's meaningful, if a client comes in and says, my head is like, I'm lost in the weeds and I'm stuck below the surface and my head's underwater, or whatever it is that they're saying, or I'm at a crossroads, and we say, and what would be different at the end of the conversation? And they might be like, I have clarity. Clarity. How do you know you have clarity? Well, I feel more like I understand what my options are. Excellent. So then are we going from, head in the weeds to clarity? Yes. Excellent. Clarity is plenty. We don't need it to be more specific and observable and measurable than that, because clarity is a felt experience for that client. It is a metaphor that they
Yeah.
understand in the framework of how they're thinking about what they want to do. And there's something else that you just said also, like, is it like, how are we doing? Moving to your 8. That is, yes, you are checking in, but it's so much more elegant when you can, and artful, honestly, when you can say, how are we doing on clarity and what else needs to be explored that would continue to invite more clarity. And the client will tell you, maybe there's nothing. I think I've got what I need. Excellent. We can move into like, how do we help them anchor and harvest their learning? Or they might be like, there's this other thing that I need to like this self-talk that I have. Excellent. Let's talk about that. Right. Like, so it's a way of also being able to, we're exploring self-talk, not your negative self-talk for the sake of the fact that you have a negative inner narrative and you should stop it, but what needs to be explored about it so that you can have more clarity, which keeps it psychologically
Yeah.
safe also.
I remember one of the recordings I sent in for my MCC. I was like, I wonder what they're going to do with this, because the goal for the session was to get a bigger true, is what my client said. And it was like, I don't know what a bigger true is, and I don't know how to measure a bigger true, but we just explored, what if you had a bigger true? And it was like, and how big does the true need to be? And she was like, I'm just so confused. I don't trust myself, this and that. I want a bigger true. And so she wanted the true to be so big that it was like a big, huge, comfy, fluffy thing that she could just lie there and it would be big enough to hold her whole body, and she could trust this is true. And so then, like, it feels like this very nebulous, like, do you need to take a class to get to it? Is there whatever? But we just had a lot of fun with that metaphor and
Well,
a bigger true and what it felt like and looked like. And it was a gorgeous session that, changed some things in her life.
yes.
And do I need to know, do I need
No.
to understand or does
Yeah.
she? And she
Yeah.
was loving playing around in that.
I love hearing this, and it's so funny. I love this bigger true because it has me. So it's not a conventional metaphor that anybody would just go, here's a metaphor I'll just throw off the top of my head, a bigger true. But for the client, that is not a novel metaphor. It might have been for you, and you didn't really need to know what it meant. But for her, because it came out of her brain, it was a conventional metaphor. There was no cognitive load on meaning. I had in one of my MCC demonstrations, my client came in and she's like, I'm in a terrible place today. And I'm like, what's going on? She's like, I'm just in this horrible, awful place. And I'm like, if you were to paint a picture of it, what does it look like? And she's like, this knotted, tangled, fuzzy ball of black darkness. And I'm like, well, I'm really hearing this fuzzy, dark, black tangled mess. It's like I see like a messy knitting yarn. And I go, what are we doing with this by the end of the session? And she goes, I'd like to have illumination. And I go, illumination. So is that what we're doing? She goes, yeah, I want the illuminated thread. And I go, so is that what we're doing? Moving from this tangled, knotted, fuzzy, black ball of strings to the illuminated thread? And she goes, that's what we're doing. And it was so fun, number one, because the illuminated thread is just it's just bringing light to something, right? Like, cool. And then at the end, it was so funny too, because I said, how did we do on getting to the illuminated thread? And she goes, well, we're not fully there, but we got a long way. And that's fine too, right? Like, it isn't that we're just going to get magic every time, that there's going to be this culmination of at the end of our conversations. And we still explored quite a ways towards this illuminated thread or
Yeah.
clarity.
I want to pull together a couple things you said that are just really interesting for me to geek out on. Is one, you were saying like you want it to come from the client, and you had also talked about clean language earlier, not that we want to get stuck in like the exact formulation of clean language. And so one thing I sometimes see with our participants at Awaken is that if it's someone who's very visual, they might say to their client, what does that look like? What does that look like? Paint me a picture, like you were just saying. And it turns out the client is auditory or kinesthetic as a driver. And they just sit there and they're like, I
Yeah,
got
I got
nothing.
nothing
I
for you.
can't answer that question. And so you probably knew with this client that she loves word pictures and stuff. And so we just invite people to use very simple, clean language and
Yeah,
open access questions. We're like, what is that like as a first question? And then listen, like, did they paint me a word picture with visuals?
yeah,
Or did they go into their body and feel something? Did they
yeah.
hear music? Were they conducting a symphony? And however you say that
Symphony.
word,
Yeah, you
symphony.
said it.
And and so then you're following.
Yeah,
Did they use visuals? Did they use ear hearing? Did they use? And then you're
yeah.
following them
And
into
so
it.
2 points to that. One, yes, I knew this client. We'd been working together for about sorry. We'd been working together for a really long time, and we're celebrating. No, we had been working together for about 6 years at that point. So I did know her very well, and she is a very visual person. And so that wasn't a leading of the client in that regard because I did know her really well. And I think to your point, it's really, really important to try and neutralize these biases that we personally have. Whatever our learning style is our bias. I tend to lean towards visual, and it makes sense in some ways. I'm a visual artist before I was a therapist and before I was a coach. And so that's where my bias is. So I do have to be really careful about that. One of the ways I handle it is, what are you noticing now? Because then that way also they can notice something physical, they can notice something auditory, they can notice something, just a experience that they're having. It could be a thought, it could be a vision, it could be anything, right? That's
Lemon
coming.
juice, it could be a taste. Yeah.
Yeah, it could be
Yeah.
anything. It could be
Yeah.
any. But
Yeah.
that noticing is such a nice neutral word for allowing people to impart any meaning they want onto it. So I like the fact that you're teaching to be much more neutral in how you respond to it and not asking them to all paint pictures. Now, if you know them really well and and that comes up, it's you're not going to harm them if they don't paint a picture. You can go, "Oops, wrong question. Let's try again." And what are you noticing right now, right? And you can just kind of default back to something different. And this is really a big part of trust also, which is as you establish and develop safety and trust within the relationship, clients will correct you all the time. And you just roll with it because it's that their autonomy and agency being demonstrated. And you just go, I'm not attached anyway, so okay, I'll just go that way then instead. It's fine.
So I'm hearing a bunch of themes just as we start wrapping up the conversation. I'm hearing a lot of partnership with the client, that the client comes up with the metaphor, you're following them, you're curious, you're right there with them using their language and letting them play in it as long as they can. um I'm really hearing client led, because of the brain science, that it does light them up when it's their words, their metaphor, that you're not necessarily introducing your own metaphors. At least most of the time you want to get it from the client. um I'm hearing that metaphors are super valuable for agreement setting. And even if you stay in the metaphoric agreement setting, even for the success measures and the whole thing, and follow it through to the end, you've done your job. You do not have to know necessarily. Like, that will happen and they will live their life in a different way once their metaphor is sorted. Um, is there anything else? I know we could talk about metaphors for 4 days straight and still be having fun, but is there any like major themes that you feel like I really want people to capture this? Oh, we talked about sematics and words and all
Yeah.
that stuff, but is there anything else that you're just like,
I
people
think
have to hear this?
I think honestly, I think if I were to say anything is become a observer of your own work. If you're not recording your work regularly and doing an analysis on your transcripts, you're missing an opportunity for growth. I mean, I use Ray Notes. I love Ray Notes. I'm in Ray Notes probably 4 times a week, whether I'm assessing other people's coaching or my own. I'm breaking down what the client said. I'm highlighting possible outcome, possible topic, possible this, possible that. Test hypotheses. Like I'm always looking for, like, I want to test this hypothesis. I want to test that one. And then I'm looking at my question and I'm thinking of choice points. Yeah, I may have loved that question. I might have nailed it. But there's probably 3 or 4 other ways I could have asked that question. And I'm thinking of those different choice points. So if I were to leave you guys with anything, become reflective in your own work and look at it and don't do it the moment you just hit record and then you stop and you go and you throw it into Ray Notes as I would do. Um, Give it a couple weeks, let it be, and then come back to it with fresh, uncritical eyes and just start going through what you're learning about what you are and are not picking up on.
I love that so much. And it's really fun. It's really fun to do. And I had someone come for mentor coaching yesterday, and it was her first ever session that she had listened to her own voice, and she just did not want to do it. I'm like, fine, go run it through a voice thing that gives you some like British male actor voice or something. Like,
It's an
it
awesome
doesn't
idea.
matter, but just do it, whatever it takes to do it. Because, and then she came to her mentor coaching and she was like, that was actually super fun. Like, this wasn't that bad. She thought it was going to be the most horrible, humiliating, cringe thing to do. And then it turned out like, oh, I learned so much, and just turned on that curiosity and what choices could I have made and how did I miss? Like they said this thing 4 times and how did I miss it? But
And that's
giving
the
yourself that
key.
like, yeah,
Yeah.
okay, what can I
That's
see and hear with the benefit of time? Not to beat yourself up,
no,
because
to
you made whatever
learn.
choice you made to learn. And it can be so fun. And hopefully, as mentor coaches and supervisors and assessors, we can make the process feel really, really good so that people come like salivating for their next
Well,
conversation and going,
I'm stealing the thing that you just shared. I'm stealing the if you don't like your voice, run it through a voice changing thing so that it can be some, you know, British guy talking instead, because it is like get distance from it so that you can look at it with neutral eyes and see what you did well and see what your growth learning opportunities are. I will be honest, it is the thing that had me move from PCC to MCC in less than 2 years because I really buckled into the MCC journey in February and I applied in July. So the ability to do transcription and really look at my work in that way changed how I thought about my work completely. And so I highly recommend it for people. You just can't argue with what you see written on the page.
yeah, I did that. I said that. And what else could I have said? And what I did wasn't wrong. It's just one of the choices
Yeah,
that I made.
just
And
a
yeah.
choice. Yeah. I love that.
Um, well, I just want to wrap up by telling our folks at Awaken, like, just read Lyssa's book. It's so fun, so easy to read, and so insightful, and just have a ton of fun with it. So, Light Up, The Science of Metaphors. Is that the correct
Coaching
title?
with
Or
metaphors. Yeah.
The
The
Science of
science of
Coaching
coaching with metaphors.
with Metaphors. Delicious book. And thank you for peppering our whole conversation today with such luscious, juicy, metaphoric language as we went along. That makes it super fun. And
Yeah.
I can't wait for our next conversation together.
Sounds fun. Thank you so much for having me on your show. And I really appreciate it. And I hope people go and have fun with their client conversations, playing with those metaphors.
We will. And thanks for helping us do that. Appreciate you.